Today on Sahara TV, our country focuses on the small West African nation of Equatorial Guinea. Nestled between Cameroon and Gabon, this Spanish-speaking country of 700,000 people is one of the African continent's poorest nations. Equatorial Guinea is Africa's fourth largest exporter of oil. However, virtually none of the citizens have seen the benefits of such wealth. Equatorial Guinea is on the UN's list of one of the least developed countries in the world. According to the UNDP Human Development Indicators, Equatorial Guinea ranks 136th out of 187 countries. Life expectancy at birth for Equatoguineans is only about 50 years. President Teodoro Obiang has been in power in Equatorial Guinea since 1979, making him the longest current sitting African president. In the 30-plus years since he has been president, he and his family have amassed a personal wealth of more than $600 million, owning assets and property all over the world, while his people remain mired in poverty. An African-American nonprofit called the Sullivan Foundation has been entrapped in controversy in the last few weeks regarding their relationship with President Obiang. They are accused of being in cahoots with Obiang to refresh his image and promote a whitewashed view of the real situation on the ground. They have organized a lavish 4-day summit for diplomats, business leaders, and international development organizations in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. Here to talk with me today is Equatoguinean human rights lawyer Tutu Alicante. He is the executive director of EG Justice, a nonprofit organization exclusively devoted to pressing for reforms in Equatorial Guinea. Mr. Alicante, thank you and welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Okay, great. Well, to start off with, first of all, Equatorial Guinea and the situation there. Not a whole lot of people know a whole lot about Equatorial Guinea. Can you sort of describe what life is like for people on the ground in Equatorial Guinea today?
Certainly. Look, Karen, when I ask my friends who live in Equatorial Guinea and have to deal with the regime that is in place today, their answer is we live in a permanent state of conditional freedoms.
Okay.
Right? They live in a situation where every single freedom is restricted. Right? Freedom of movement is considerably restricted because there are so many illegal roadblocks all over the country. Freedom of the press, there is no freedom of the press. There is no freedom of association or freedom of assembly. So they live in this, and when you look at basic rights, rights to decent, to affordable education, decent housing, decent healthcare, all of those are in short supply in Equatorial Guinea, and that is that's the condition under which most people live, right? With lacking the most basic necessities.
Mm-hmm. And with the conditions that you just described, I mean, how do people cope? Some of the contacts that you have on the ground, how are people sort of dealing with this, or are they just sort of, making themselves that this is just how life is?
Yeah, well, it's quite telling. When you ask someone from Equatorial Guinea, how are you doing today? The answer is always a version of, look, I'm just surviving, right, or doing the best we can, and that implicitly is a show of unhappiness. People in Equatorial Guinea are unhappy, right? Most people in Equatorial Guinea know by now that they live in a very, very rich country. They see the lifestyle of the political elite. They know how the son and how the sons of the presidents and how the president and his family live, and the type of monies they are spending in lavish lifestyles in Europe and in the US and other places, right? So people are dissatisfied with the status quo. There is absolutely no doubt, right?
And with these terrible conditions, I mean, why is there so little international attention on Equatorial Guinea? I mean, we see pictures of poverty and suffering from all over Africa, but for some reason, Equatorial Guinea seems to escape that narrative when it comes to the international media.
Well, I'm glad Sahara Reporters, is reporting on this. Hopefully, you can avoid those escape that isolation trap, for lack of a better word. But clearly, Equatorial Guinea is isolated for many, many reasons. One of them being definitely the fact that it is the only Spanish-speaking country in sub-Saharan Africa, right? That in and of itself separates us from all the other African countries. So there are very few common threads between Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon or Gabon, its neighbors, right?
Sure.
So that is one. But even beyond that, is the government that we have in place. President Obiang has been in power, as you mentioned in your introduction, now for 33 years, right? And in those 33 years, he's done his best to control and manipulate access to and the tools for information. So the flow of information in basically drip by drip, drop by drop. There is very little flow of information in the country. There are things that happen in Equatorial Guinea that I, outside Equatorial Guinea, know about it before most people there.
Wow.
And that's because I call people on a constant basis, right? So when you have a government that is intent of controlling access to, absolutely controlling access to information, then people outside Equatorial Guinea do not know. Plus, when you have a government that is willing to invest millions and millions of dollars to pay PR firms to wash their image, then the information that does filter out is filtered, is claimed, right? It's not the message about what is actually happening inside the country.
Right, and going back to the media freedom situation, I think the Committee to Protect Journalists has ranked Equatorial Guinea as one of the 10 most censored countries in the world. They ranked them as number 5, actually. You've already mentioned there is no freedom of the press. Are there journalists, or is there any access to the internet at all? Are there any sort of attempts by people to, report and have any form of journalism in the country?
Look, I'll tell you an anecdotal story, which you should have been able to read on CPJ, on the Committee to Protect Journalists paper. In June 2011, there was a group of, I think, 3 journalists from ZDF, a German television network, who were in Equatorial Guinea to report about women's soccer, right? It was ahead of the Women's World Cup, which was going to be held in Germany, and there was an Equatoguinean player who was playing in the Women's Bundesliga. After recording for 3-4 days, right before they left the airport, these German journalists, confiscated by the government, all the material destroyed or taken away by the government. Now, this is how we treat, or this is how they treat journalists from abroad reporting on soccer.
Imagine how
For
much.
that reason,
right. Imagine how much more so if they came to report on the actual conditions on the ground or on the political situation. To confiscate.
And that's why you don't have independent journalists able or capable of documenting what's happening inside the country.
Right. So, moving on, and you mentioned that Equatoguineans are acutely aware of the fact that their leaders live these lavish lifestyles while they themselves, are still remaining in poverty. And of course, part of that is due to, we mentioned it before, Equatorial Guinea being the 4th largest producer of oil.
Yes.
So I guess it's safe to say that Equatorial Guinea did not escape the resource curse, correct?
I think we are probably the best example of the resource curse, right? The best example, or the emblematic example of what happened. You have vast amount of petrodollars in the hands or controlled by a group of people who are beholden to no one, who are accountable to no one. We are a prime example of that. This is a country of 500,000 people, right? Between 500,000 and 700,000 people, with the highest GDP per gross domestic product per capita, and not just on the continent. Well, definitely on the continent, but among the top 5, right? And yet, most people in this country still live in poverty. Right. And that's because one family basically runs the country as a private factory, basically.
And as far as the oil, who are the partners? I would assume the United States. Who are the main countries that are importing oil from Equatorial Guinea?
Yeah, the oil is all produced, refined, and later on exported by American companies, right? Major American companies, ExxonMobil, Amaret Hess, Noble Energy, and Marcon, right? These are the major, and they work with contractors, Schlumberger and other contractors, but they're all Americans. We know that British Gas, for instance, has some of the concessions to the gas. And we also know that now increasingly there is a larger presence or increasingly larger presence of Chinese and other smaller companies. But majority of the oil is the concessions are held by American companies.
Right. Okay. So moving on from there back to who's the prime beneficiary of the oil, President Teodoro Obiang. Again, he's been in power for 33 years. And is Africa's longest serving current president. As far as the ability for him to remain in power, obviously part of it is scraping from the oil revenues from the country. But can you talk a little bit about the political manipulations that allow him to remain in power for so long?
Yeah, certainly. Look, President Obiang runs Equatorial Guinea. To give you a historical perspective here, the way Louis XIV, King Louis XIV ran France, right, where he believes that he is the state, right? President Obiang would tell you publicly that there is no corruption in Equatorial Guinea because he controls every single expenditure by the state. Anything that is purchased in the state, any salary that is paid by any ministries, any acquisitions or investments by the state have to have the signature of President Obiang. And that's how he controls Equatorial Guinea, right? Without a doubt, oil revenues, oil was discovered in the mid-1990s, right? Prior to that, Equatorial Guinea was in many ways unknown country, right? We were poor, we were isolated, we were repressive. But almost overnight, in the mid-1990s, Equatorial Guinea becomes one of the richest countries in the world, right? And that oil, through corruption, basically, has allowed Obiang to further entrench his power, right? Nepotism, paying, every single parliamentarian in Equatorial Guinea, except the one parliamentarian that represents the opposition.
Right, out of 100, correct?
Out of 100, yes. It's handpicked by President Obiang. Right. And these people have to stay there and do what Obiang wants, because otherwise they will not have access to the resources that Obiang makes available to them. The ministers, every single one is handpicked by him. The judges are handpicked by him. So that system of nepotism and cronyism created by, fueled by all this oil money, as well as control of the resources or sources of information that I mentioned earlier, and control of the military, allows Obiang to stay in power.
Yeah, so let's move on to the sort of the current issue of the day, which is the involvement of the U.S.-based nonprofit Sullivan Foundation, or fully the Leon H. Sullivan Foundation, named for a civil rights leader, and they have come under fierce criticism by international groups and human rights organizations for hosting their Sullivan Summit, their Africa Rising Summit in Equatorial Guinea, starting August 20th. Now, I guess I'm wanting you to respond to some of the controversy. Do you know what are their goals? What are their aims? They're being accused of basically acting as PR for Obiang. And can you talk a little bit about what they say they're aiming to do, or how they're trying to explain their relationship with President Obiang?
Look, I think I'll leave it up to Hope to tell us what her aims are. Clearly, President Obiang has unbridled access to a lot of money, right? He doesn't have to respond to anyone. And Obiang also has a damaged image that he's trying to repair. And it is quite conceivable to me, the organizations like Sullivan Foundation, that has access to people in power, as they claim on their website, that they're the only organization that has had President Bush, President Clinton, and I don't know who else speak on their behalf. Well, if they feel that they have access and they can help clean that image, it is conceivable to me that they will then side with the likes of Obiang, as they have supported previous dictators in other occasions, right? We also know that, for instance, they held a couple of their summits. A couple of summits ago, they held it in Harare, Zimbabwe, right? So it tells you a little bit, what they're doing with these. with their organization and what their aims might be.
And as for they make a lot of claims according to the Sullivan Foundation's website when they're promoting their Africa Rising Summit. They claim that there are substantial political reforms being made in Equatorial Guinea. From your experience, is this true?
Karen, if by substantial political reforms, Ms. Master Sullivan means that Obiang has instituted his son as vice president, obviously I disagree with her, right? If she means that Obiang has changed the constitution to further monopolize political power, obviously I disagree with her that that's a substantial reform. Now, if by substantial reform she's thinking about the fact that now Obiang is inviting Sullivan Foundation to come glorify him, well, if that's what she sees as substantial reform, clearly that's not the type of reform, or that's not something that most Equatoguineans, including myself, see as reform, right? Not, I mean, I would like for her to point out at the reform that she's talking about,
right,
because we are waiting to see that reform.
Right, and they also claim that there are significant improvements in Equatorial Guinea's human rights record. Is that true?
That is not correct. One of my colleagues and friends was just in prison for 3 months for absolutely no reason other than political harassment, right? And we know that arbitrary detentions and harassment of people that oppose the government continue to happen on a daily basis in Equatorial Guinea. Right. So I don't know what type of improvement she's pointing at.
And lastly, Hope Masters on Twitter, responding to some of the criticisms, said that the Sullivan Foundation has invited you and E.G. Justice to Equatorial Guinea to come see the transformation on the ground. Is that true?
That is not true. I am from Equatorial Guinea. I don't know if Hope Masters know this, and I speak to people in Equatorial Guinea on a daily basis. I don't know if she knows that either. So I don't need to go to Equatorial Guinea to know what's happening in Equatorial Guinea today. I don't need to go to Equatorial Guinea to know that Obiang has been in power for 33 years and he has won elections by 99%, 97%, and 95%. I don't need to go to Equatorial Guinea to know that my family does not have running water and electricity. Right? Look, Karen, this is an organization, the Sullivan Foundation is an organization that is funded to honor the legacy of a man who once said that without, how do you put it? Without personal freedoms, there is no peace, right? And in Equatorial Guinea, as I expressed earlier on, there are no personal freedoms. People do not have personal freedoms, right? So the fact, if the Sullivan Foundation could tell me that they're going to Equatorial Guinea to hold a summit with the people, it'd be something else, right? Because quite frankly, if you care about the plight of people in Africa, then you should be working with the people in Africa, right? Not the dinosaurs and the hypos that have kept us, oppressed for 30-something years.
Right. Now, to wrap up, what message do you and E.G. Justice have for the Sullivan Foundation and for anybody who has been invited to attend or to speak at this upcoming Africa Rising Summit? What message would you send to them?
Yeah. Well, it's quite simple, Karen. Respect for people's dignity, respect for people's basic rights should be at the forefront of any talks, any engagements, any activities the organization like Sullivan Foundation undertake in Africa. All right, a deep conviction, a deep commitment to justice and equality should guide the work, the involvement of organizations like Sullivan in Africa, instead of, in my opinion, the smell of petrodollars, the color of those petrodollars.
Fantastic. Well, Mr. Alicante, we'll be following this story closely. We'll be watching the developments on the summit. Thank you so much for joining us today on SaharaTV.
Well, I should thank you, and I should thank SaharaTV for taking an interest in these stories.
No problem. That's our job.
Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Okay, so that was Mr. Tutu Alicante, the Executive Director of E.G. Justice. He can be found on Twitter at Tutu Alicante, and you can also find E.G. Justice on Twitter as well. Stay tuned for more from SaharaTV.